research here, and so I have a question about how that links to your research and what the actual claim is. So here, is it the case that poverty predicts poor health outcomes because of your relative position in the hierarchy, or is it because you have reduced resources? So is it controlling for reduced resources, basically?
Right. So, and this is where I made assumptions about familiarity with that literature, so my apologies for that. So income inequality, this was something that was challenged very robustly for quite some time until huge databases were mined. And even if you partial out the relative risk associated with lifestyle or access to resources, your position on that gradient matters. People who believe those data, right, there are a few who are still cynical about that, but it's called the psychosocial pathways, right? So that the people who adopt the psychosocial models of income inequality are in this camp that say, no, actually your relative experience in this gradient matters even when you control for access to resources. And I find those data quite powerful, so I tend to like that psychosocial pathway literature. And Michael Meany's work with rats, I think, is also showing that these pathways are pretty clear. And we don't have the same sort of access to resources issue in rats. So the animal models are also pretty compelling. That's the first part of it. Yeah.
So then, like, going back to your field study, is there within population inequality between group inequalities that play out in the same way?
Right. So I made the case for the income inequality. And one of the things that's really interesting is that it's assumed that income inequality doesn't matter in contexts like the pastoralists of northern Kenya, because they're reasonably egalitarian and there isn't the same sort of gradient. But it's not been tested. And so most people who work in social epi feel like it's, if you've got a high Gini coefficient, that sort of, crude indicator of income inequality in a country, then you can expect to start to see some impact of that gradient in communities. But they don't expect to find it in these groups. I think it's worth testing. I don't think you'll find that same powerful gradient, but what I do think the endemic violence is doing is creating groups of outcasts. It's creating larger groups of people who've had to completely fall out of the system. Like, one of my fears is that widows are the biggest group that are falling out of this system and essentially winding up as beggars in town centers. And so, again, in those instances in northern Kenya, it could really literally be access to resources and not the psychosocial gradient. But it hasn't been tested.
And between groups, is there a hierarchy that everybody agrees to? Or
No. No. Everyone agrees the Picard are the most successful, but that's a little different than this sort of gradient of relative wealth. I'm seeing greater diversity of wealth than was true in the 90s. And I think it looks like the data are going to bear that out. But again, it's still pretty, I've only gotten round 1 and 2 really done reasonably well. And round 1 and 2, it definitely appears that way. But anyway, does that answer the question? Yeah, okay. Yeah.
So I want to push you a little bit on this point you made at the end about getting intervention right. It's important. So early in the talk you referenced Barker, and suppose we were to take something like fetal programming as the topic of interest, right? It seems to me that it, depending on the duration of the intervention, if the intervention means, pacifying a violent region and, improving the standard of living of that whole section of the world, then, I'm all for that intervention, right?
That's right.
That's the kind of intervention that we're very unlikely to be able to achieve.
Right.
So suppose it's the case that, your intervention is much more, pragmatically scaled, and you can do something like you have African Union troops that can set up a feeding station or something, or some safe harbor where pregnant women can go and be safe from violence and have an adequate food supply, right? If you say, well, we don't really care whether this is fetal programming or whether this is a pathological outcome, your intervention is potentially liable to fail, because suppose that it is the case that that there's adaptive fetal programming going on, where in a world of substantial episodic scarcity, the experience of that prenatally leads individuals to a thrifty genotype, and a bunch of things about salt retention and other things that may make them well adapted to, a live fast, die young strategy in a world of scarcity. Okay, you take people out of that world and you put them in the little intervention world for the course of 9 months. Okay, and all that you're doing then is producing babies that are expecting a world that doesn't exist. That is, if you can't actually pacify the region, if you can't actually improve people's access to healthcare and the regularity of their food supply, then saying, well, we don't know if it's fetal programming or pathological outcome may lead your intervention to actually make matters worse if it is fetal programming and not a pathological outcome, right? Because you're preparing people for a world that doesn't exist, that they're ill-prepared for the reality of the face. So it seems to me that it's really important whether the public health people should really care whether this is an adaptive mechanism at work or a pathological outcome. It's not enough to say the intervention worked, because you can't define the intervention working at birth weight. You have to define it at survival at age 5 and survival at age 10 and survival at age 15 and timing of menarche and ultimate success down the road. So it seems to me, I think I disagree with that claim. As long as the intervention worked, we don't care, because you can't say whether the intervention worked or not without that.
Well, okay, so that's good. You give me a chance there to clarify a little. And what's interesting is that I craft that actually to anthropologists. So there was a recent issue of the American Journal of Human Biology where there was quite a bit of concern about when is it that we will actually move away from these notions of adaptive responses? And there's a large body of work perpetuated, but that's not polite. So Gluckman and Hansen's work sort of calling it adaptive predictive response, or predictive adaptive responses, linked primarily to this sort of early fetal programming, this thrifty metabolism, if you will. And they're making this broader claim that within certain parameters, this is something that makes sense, right? I believe that. I believe that given cues of a low-quality maternal environment, it makes sense to have a thriftier fetus, right? It makes sense from life history theory perspective as well. All right, so, but there are not all anthropologists support this. Not all biological anthropologists support this. It still feels like adaptation without taking into account functional outcomes. I think we've moved beyond that. But what seems to be interesting is the slow rate at which the global health community is interested in unpacking functional response as a way to understand intervention. Because the truth is, if you look at Barker's work, or if you look at Michael Meany's work, if you look at some of the new diet during pregnancy work, it's multiple generations. The intervention that's suggested from this is multiple generations. And that's just a really hard pill to swallow, I think, because it's essentially saying, oh, let's get rid of poverty, right? So I agree with you. And I didn't make that point clear. And I'm still a little surprised that given the robustness of the findings of this intergenerational research, that anthropologists aren't sort of saying, well, okay, how do we make this work with a global health perspective? How do we say that functional response can be as robust as pathological outcome? In fact, it's a better way to evaluate. It's a better way to evaluate birth weight. Are we going to see or need 3 generations of intervention because birth weights are reasonably low? So that's my mistake. I actually feel like that was speaking to some of my peers in the American Journal of Human Biology. I don't know who's next.
Well, I just wanted to share that maybe you're aware of this, but there's going to be a special issue in developmental psychology on this idea that these things can be viewed as functional responses rather than pathology. So there's analogous debates to the kinds of debates that you're referring to in developmental psychology about things like risk-taking in adolescence. So it's often described as maladaptive behavior in developmental psychology and viewed as sort of pathological behavior that we should sort of try to, try to help people get rid of that behavior because it's bad. And that's sort of a very normative approach to
Yeah.
the phenomena rather than, maybe this is a functional response under certain conditions for people to adopt.
Right.
So I just wanted to let you know that there's going to be a special issue on this topic. So maybe it's interesting.
It rings a bell. Bruce Ellis isn't a part of that. Okay, all right. That's where I saw it. Then the evolution reading list. Okay, yeah, no, and that's really. I think functional responses are more interesting than just calling something pathological outcome, but that's probably just my training. So, yeah, Sarah.
I was wondering what might be some other differences between your highly affected and low affected sites and all these different ethnic groups, whether there's difference in access to health care, whether there's differences in the proportion of the population that are given up nomadic pastoralism because they've lost all the animals. So essentially some other variables that may mediate the endemic, the risk of violence.
There are some important ones. I think if I were to take you to this slide, right, one of the things you can see is that the classic pattern, this group, the Picot less affected site, has significantly fewer animals than is true for the highly affected site. And they live very close to a dam, so rates of infectious disease are just through the roof. So they look more like settled pastoralists. Even though they still are keeping a nomadic lifestyle, they're not moving quite as often, and they live close to, so there are lots of specifics there that place them at a different level of risk for poor health than just being out of the, well, I mean, they're doing worse than the highly affected site, and it's partly because they don't have the same access to animals and they're near a dam. This, obviously, there are more settled in this Turkana less affected site, or you wouldn't see the percent of literacy and education that you do. So fewer livestock, but higher education levels, a little more settled. Anyway, so there are, that's the trickiest bit. The Samburu are much more evenly matched in terms of both being nomadic groups. But we're not seeing the same kinds of differences in biological experience, although I think the mental health surveys will look very different between the less affected and highly affected site, and First Pass suggests they do. Yeah, so those are some important differences, and it really screws up the case control. But what can you do? Oh, Brooke, yeah.
So I'm curious about the rating link to nutrition, because I guess my impression about rating was that it was sort of a constant redistribution of wealth, and so, I mean, those cows that are being taken from some people and leaving them hungry are obviously going to somebody else, right? And so, and then I figured the same people who are offensive in one circumstance are going to be defensive in another. So how does that, is it sort of just causing more of an up and down on their nutrition that's having the negative effect, or? Right.
So that's part of what we're excited about doing with the longitudinal data. The drought, of course, will sort of put a weird spike in that, but that's life on the plains, right? So I think we're going to find the up and down. I think that's what we're going to find. If we could survey the entire area, I think we'd see who were the winners and who were the losers a little more clearly. But based on the groups we have decided to follow, we have a sense of where those animals go, but then they come back. And there is a lot more redistributing, but some families just don't make it. And so we're really interested in those families that in this process of ebb and flow of livestock from one community to the next, who are the ones that fall out, and who are the ones who are able to just build again and keep going. And what do those households look like? Are they younger? Are they older? What are they, right? And what are they doing to stay a part of this ebb and flow of livestock? The Picot are the winners overall, but Picot women and children are not the winners, as you can see. Men are keeping the animals far away, and they won't bring them back because they won't let the women. They're keeping the women and children in one place and making sure that the attacks don't happen in these hidden areas of the Picot Hills. They are protecting the women and children, but leaving them with almost nothing to eat. Almost nothing to eat. So it's an interesting trade-off that they're making there. And women complain about it bitterly. So, yeah, I think you were next, sorry.
Yeah, just two questions of clarification.
Mm-hmm.
Regard to this slide, so didn't you say that the average BMI is 18 to 22? Is that
Normal BMI
Normal
by
BMI.
reference standards is 18.5 to 22. Yeah.
for those people?
No,
Or
that's
in the West?
that's the West. Yeah, that's
I
the
see, okay.
even the World Health uses that
I see.
criteria. Yeah.
What, one other,
Mhm.
I'm not trying to be particular. There's two 20s, am I missing something?
Oh,
Or is it supposed to go up to 24?
it was supposed to go to 22. My apologies. I have no idea.
Okay. Sorry, I just want to make sure I wasn't
Microsoft ceremony.
missing something.
This is Keynote.
Well, then it must be your fault.
Exactly. I used Keynote thinking I could avoid silliness like, oh well.
Oh, there's two 16s as well.
Yeah. Oh. I wonder if there's a hidden graph under there. I don't know what I've done. This is what you shouldn't play with slides on the plane. I think that's what happened. I played with this slide. Yeah. Well, thank goodness. All right. Sorry about that. All right. Yeah.
So just with reference to what you just said about the Picot in the last question, are they at least increasing in size? Are they recruiting more migrants? Are they having more children, just equal quality children? Where is that extra wealth of cows going?
You might not see it yet, right?
You may not yet. I don't know how long they've been the more successful group also.
I'd say for a good
Yeah.
decade or more. What's your read? I would say since the early 90s. Most people consider the Picot the more successful because they were willing to go be much more violent up front. And that fear has lasted for quite some time. Okay, so we will have the data for this for our households. And I don't know, my impression is that fertility is higher in these in Picot communities. But if they keep the livestock away from women and children for very long, then it won't stay that way, right? And right now, it's also possible that we aren't seeing the impact yet. We may need more time to see what they're doing with the wealth. Everyone is so afraid of losing more livestock during the drought that they just wouldn't take off milk even. They took all the milking animals away. They'd leave one goat in a compound with 10 children under the age of 5.
They don't bring milk bottles from
No. Yeah, no. And so then women would say, what? We don't have enough breasts to feed all these children. What are we supposed to do about this? They were really distressed about it. Yeah, so for the 4 rounds all combined should give us a better idea of, I know there are differences in the Picot communities, it hasn't come up in the preliminary analyses. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have any data or an intuition as to the shape of the utility function between number of cattle and fitness, or some indicator of fitness, like fertility or something? So how much worse off are you if you have 15 cattle than 20, or 5 than 15? Linear? Do you have an intuition?
Oh, I would love to do a utility function of, of that. There isn't one. But what we do know is that diversity of species places households in much better shape. So if your balance of camels to small stock is good, your household does better because camels are the mainstay. And goats, boy, you can just get goat's milk pretty darn easily. So those cattle are highly valued, but the least reliable milk producers. So that we know from previous studies that balance of livestock matters quite a bit. And then above and beyond that, sheer numbers matters, but up to a point. Because once your herds get too big, then if you don't have the right labor pool, then the household gets strained to manage all those livestock. Does that make sense? So there, it's that I don't think it's linear. In fact, I'm pretty sure I've just argued that it's not. But it is an important, I think that you find really interesting correlation points all along that potential axis of livestock and fitness. Yeah. You need them in the first place to even be able to feed your family, because those who fall out don't do well at all. Fertility is significantly lower among settled pastoralists than is true for the nomadic, even though nutrition is slightly lower. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I'm interested in these norms you described that are enhancing cooperation within polygynous marriages.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that there are a number of possibilities, and I'm curious whether you have even anecdotal observations that would help us tease them apart. So one possibility is that there's sororal polygyny, and so senior wives basically have a self-interest in maximizing harmony simply because the welfare of all the co-wives is their own welfare. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Another possibility is that that there is labor sharing such that senior wives do better even if they're unrelated, because when cooperation is higher, then the proceeds of cooperation are greater for all the parties.
Mm-hmm.
A third possibility is that neither the first two obtain, and that individual senior wife fitness is actually disadvantaged by being a better peacekeeper and a less self-interested actor, but it's a group functional outcome, right? So that people are internalizing a norm that works well at the level of the group by maximizing household harmony and therefore success within the ethnic group.
Mm-hmm.
But that it's actually to senior wives' disadvantage, and they would be better off being more self-interested. Do you have any, even just casual observations that would help us to differentiate between those?
Oh. I do. I hadn't, for some reason, never really put it in that framework, and that's a really interesting framework to place it in. There is considerable variation in how harmonious, that's their term, right? How harmonious these households are. Sometimes fights are brutal and violent, and some women are literally chased out, just absolutely chased out, and have to go live at the town center because they just can't be a part of that household. And some women choose not to be anywhere near the rest of those crazy co-wives, as they'd say. So there's a lot of variation in how the strategies that households co-wives take. My guess is that there is considerable benefit to being a little selfish, and yet there are households that aren't. First wives have first pass at bridewell, take the cattle off to marry off their sons. If you're a fourth wife, odds of you're getting any cattle for your sons to marry are pretty low these days. So there is some general value in being a little selfish in these situations, and yet there are households that are like that, where it's each co-wife for herself. Children don't even really, they still call each other brother and sister, but they don't go and help the other co-wife. It's just not at all harmonious. And then there are these households where children move from one hut to the next, all co-wives are mother. It's just really extraordinary. One hint I would say, why do you see this variation? And women said to me, it depends on if you like the man or not. So if you're, I'm paraphrasing, if your husband's an asshole, better to work together. If he's a good man, we all fight. Now, not every woman said this. If he's a good man, we all fight over access to that good man, which was just hysterical. I just thought that was great. But anyway, that's sort of what they'd say.
So you mentioned that women can gain prestige by being senior wives in a harmonious household. What are the proceeds of that, right? So how does that cash out that you're well regarded? Does that translate into
Yeah.
access to other opportunities
It
down
does.
the road?
It does. It does. And it translates into being, despite all the violence I've described, and despite the fact that women will just hit their husbands right back if they're beaten, not all of them, but right? So there is this sort of violence. There is some prestige that comes from, if your co-wives think highly of you and you're a senior co-wife, you have more sway with the elders. You have, your word means more, and you're more often called to these sort of group discussions when it comes to how the community's doing. So it plays out in this broader social capital, if you will, which then you may not be able to marry off every single one of your sons, but your own community standing is, and people will say, oh, that woman deals with her household and all the wives very well. They will say, and they'll point you to her. So it was reasonably easy to figure out which houses were harmonious and which ones weren't. Yeah, I'd not thought of it that way, but there are benefits, aren't there? Yeah. Yep, yeah.
So just following up on the co-wife question, so you've shown that they were 1.8 times more likely to something, I forgot what the
Have a normal birth weight.
have a normal birth rate if they listed social support, and co-wife was one of the things. So, so it's the household head divides the herds and assigns a set of animals for each of the wives.
Right.
So do you know whether there's actually much transfer of material resources once those assignments have been made across these mothers' households, or at what would be the resource that's actually mediating this?
Well, so, and I don't know if this is true for all of the Turkana, but for the Nisan-Yoka, it's her father allocates the animals after the wealth exchange. So the household head is not really totally the one responsible. It's how much the father shares with the daughter to send her off. So some fathers are a little more generous than others. But there's some pressure to keep it reasonably even across co-wives, as you can imagine. Transfer,
Like, are they sharing milk and stuff?
So in the harmonious households, they will, but more importantly, they share labor. And that's, food didn't wind up being the most important driving factor in weight gain. It was whether or not a woman could stop doing her basic household activities. Could she take longer rests? Did she have to do as much work in the third trimester or not? It was really activity levels that drove that weight gain in the third trimester. And so it translated into cooperation, basically, where women helping out the ones who were pregnant and recently breastfeeding. And there was a lot of, it was an important thing to say you did for your co-wife, but it didn't always happen. You were supposed to help a co-wife, but obviously they don't all do that. So it's really exchange of labor, I guess, is the answer to the question. Surprisingly, you would think it would be food. And there is some food sharing, definitely. Sometimes women would say, I'm way too tired, and one would cook a huge pot and feed all the children, which is a big help in a couple of different ways. Yeah. Yeah.
Presumably, most of the folks living in this population, most of the women are not using contraceptives?
That's right. That's right. I didn't say that, did I? Yeah. No, that's definitely a non-contracepting population. They use abortifacients, but they don't use contraception. Yeah.
You mentioned that there's a sort of culture of violence, not just among women, but between men and women, right?
Yeah.
And women back actually towards their husbands.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Are you witness to these kinds of things, or you just hear about them, or?
All of the above. Yeah. The witnessing had more to do with how my senior man research assistant came to work on certain days. His wives were bigger than he was, and he picked fights a lot, and he would come beaten up pretty regularly to work. And it took me a while to figure out what was happening, and then I finally just asked, and he said, and I would say, Eliud, you're smaller than I am. Your wives are twice your size. Why would you pick fights with them? Anyway, so Turkana women are known to be feisty. Yeah, Turkana children too. Mm-hmm. That was the consensus of all of the research assistants from all the ethnic groups. Like, Turkana kids are the hardest. They're the toughest. They'll throw sticks at you rather than talk to you. But Picot were the, anyway.
There's some, not a lot, some psychological evidence suggesting that women increase in physical strength as a function of conception risk across the menstrual cycle. So higher fertility there, particularly if they find themselves in a dangerous situation. At least in one study, they seem to actually have a higher hand grip strength. And it seemed like an interesting way to, perhaps test the implications of that one study. Actually, the story behind that study is that women, particularly at high fertility, in a sense, actually have more motivation to avoid sexual bullying.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so might actually be more vigilant, maybe be a little stronger, those kinds of things at that time of the month. If you have a lot of situations actually where women are oftentimes engaged in physical violence, you might imagine it would be almost an ideal place to study that kind of stuff behaviorally.
Do you have a sense for how many successive cycles women typically have between lactation and pregnancy?
Yes, and it's age-related. You're not surprised. In the 20s, it's about 2, and then it's somewhere around 3 to 4. They don't cycle much during their reproductive careers, because one thing I didn't say is age at menarche is 16 on average. So late initiation of menstruation, and reasonably early menopause, which is pretty characteristic of communities like this with kind of chronically marginal nutrition, 44, 45. So pretty short reproductive careers, but a lot of babies in there.
How
Yeah.
long between the time of, age at menarche and marriage, or the time women start having children?
So for Turkana, there's a really strong relationship to marriage. So it's about 21. 21 is the average age at first birth. So there does seem to be a couple of years of adolescent subfecundity in there, but it's also pretty strongly linked to marriage. Out of wedlock is highly discouraged. I'd be willing to bet that's changed quite a bit since we've done much of this reproductive research in the early 90s. I'd be willing to bet that there's some relaxation of the stigma associated with out of wedlock births. But some of that should appear because these households include 20-year-old girls, and average age at marriage hasn't changed from what we can tell, but I bet age at birth might have, age at first birth might have. Yeah.
I think we need to leave it there. Thank you.
All right.